Okay, I think we're going to start now, everyone. So kia ora and welcome everyone to the December Fulbright New Zealand Good Works Alumni Seminar. This is our final seminar of the year, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you so much to all of our presenters and all of our panelists who've taken part in this series and who've shared their extraordinary work and research with us over the year. So for me, it's been really, really humbling, not only to watch and to listen to these seminars, but also just to see how willing Fulbright alumni have been to share their work with us and to volunteer to do these talks and these presentations. Individual scholarship has always been important to the Fulbright mission, but so too are the deep people-to-people connections that this Fulbright program fosters. And by sharing your stories and your research with us, you're continuing to honour that legacy, and we're really, really thankful. Today's talk marks International Human Rights Day, and we are thrilled to have with us Rez Gardi. I'm going to read out Rez's bio, and I hope it doesn't intimidate too many of you. It's pretty impressive. Rez Gardi is an international international lawyer and human rights activist. She was born in a refugee camp in Pakistan as her family escaped Saddam Hussein's genocidal campaign against the Kurds. Arriving in New Zealand with nothing, Rez sought to use her difficult start in life as motivation to succeed, becoming New Zealand's first Kurdish lawyer. She recently graduated as a Fulbright Scholar with a Master of Laws from Harvard Law School, and she is the first Kurd in history to graduate from Harvard Law. She's worked as the Harvard Center Human Rights Fellow in Iraq, building cases for the prosecution of ISIS for their targeted genocidal campaign against the Yazidis. She also is a visiting lecturer in law at the University of Kurdistan, Hula, teaching comparative constitutional law and international human rights. She's the founder of Empower, a youth-led organization aiming to address the underrepresentation of refugees in higher education. She's also the co-founder of the Center for the Asia-Pacific Refugee Studies, an academic institution based at the University of Auckland. Rez has a wealth of experience advocating for the rights of refugees at global fora. She represented New Zealand in the first ever Global Refugee Youth Consultations in Geneva in 2016 and was one of the founding members of the Global Youth Advisory Council to the UNHCR. She was awarded the Young New Zealander of the Year Award in 2017 for her services to human rights, and she was a Woman of Influence finalist and Next Woman of the Year finalist in 2018. In 2019, she was awarded the Outstanding Youth Delegate Award at the UN Youth Assembly and selected as an Eisenhower Youth Fellow. In 2020, she was awarded a Global Impact Award for her work fighting for justice for Yazidis, and in 2021, she was selected as a Peace Ambassador for the One Young World Summit, recognizing her work to hold members of ISIS accountable for their heinous crimes. So these are all pretty impressive accolades and a pretty impressive bio for someone so young. And we're just really, really pleased to have you with us today, Rez. So just to give everyone a bit of an outline of how today's talk is going to go, Rez is going to speak for a little while about her own experience, some of the work that she's been doing and so on. And we are aware that there'll be lots of questions that might come up as she's speaking. So I would encourage everyone to either include your question in the chat box or write it down on a bit of paper and ask it yourself at the end. So we'll have questions at the end for those of you who have them. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Rez. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Therese. Tēnā koutou katoa, tēnā au, ko Zagros te maunga, ko Tigris te awa, ko Gardi te iwi, ko tika tangata te waka, ko Rez Gardi aho. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks so much for the opportunity to speak to you all today. It's a very important occasion firstly marking International Human Rights Day, and it also happens to be my mother's birthday, and it makes sense considering she has been such a fierce human rights activist her whole life that her birthday falls on International Human Rights Day. It's been an eventful and challenging couple of years for all of us around the globe. With the pandemic, I'm sure MENA, it's had considerable impact on us in a number of different ways. Today, I guess I'd like to do things maybe a little bit differently. Rather than doing a more strict presentation, I want to just talk about some of the work that I did on the ground in Kurdistan, and then allow you to perhaps ask some questions about that particular work. So after graduating from Harvard, I was awarded a Harvard Satter Human Rights Fellowship. The Satter Human Rights Fellowship is designed to support and promote human rights defense in response to mass atrocity or widespread and severe patterns of rights abuse. So it's for very particular types of work. The fellowship focuses on human rights violations in countries designated as not free, according to the Freedom House's Freedom in the World Index. And I explain a little bit about that in a moment. But basically, the fellowship is limited to work on the following areas. So it has to be situations of mass atrocity, situations of widespread and severe violations of human rights, such as crimes against humanity that may be associated with civil conflict, failed states, authoritarian leaders, or other highly repressive regimes. Or alternatively, a situation of transition in the aftermath of the conditions that I just described in the two criteria. So very strict criteria about what kind of work can be awarded a human rights Satter Fellowship. So the region that I had chosen to go to, the Kurdish region, falls within the formal borders of Iraq. And on the Freedom House's Freedom in the World Index, Iraq's total score and status is 29 out of 100. So very clearly falls within the not free category. In particular, for political rights, it ranked 16 out of 100, and for civil liberties, 13 out of 100. For comparison, a country like New Zealand scores about 99 out of 100. And so we're talking about countries and parts of the world where they have been ranked as not free according to a whole number of criteria in terms of freedoms and civil liberties and political rights. When I first made the decision to work in the Kurdish region of Iraq for an organization on the ground, I knew that there would be many challenges involved. Firstly, the region has not enjoyed a period without calamities as long as I can remember, from the Anfal genocide, the Kurdish genocide that my parents fled from, followed by the Iran-Iraq war, the decade of internal conflicts, the Iraq war, and then the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and his regime. And then just when there was some hope for peace and security, ISIS sieged the region. In addition to that, the Kurdish region has faced some severe backlash from the federal Iraqi government, as well as from Iran and Turkey after the 2017 referendum for independence. So with knowledge of all of this, the political climate, you can imagine I was prepared for the worst case scenario entering work in this particular region. The work that I'd chosen to do was very much aligned with the Satter's mass atrocities condition. So the criteria that it fell within situations of widespread and severe violations of human rights, such as crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes. And so I worked as part of an international team of lawyers, and our work was aimed at gathering evidence of the targeted genocidal campaign carried out by ISIS against the Yazidi minority population in the region. This included mass executions, kidnapping, torture, sexual violence, violence and other egregious human rights abuses. And to do this work, we would use a victim-centric approach. The aim of all this work gathering evidence was to use this evidence to then build cases in collaboration with relevant European and Iraqi or Kurdish authorities to prosecute the ISIS perpetrators. So though initially my fellowship faced a bumpy start for reasons that were beyond the region and the crises that it has experienced, I was supposed to start my fellowship back in October 2019 after I had just finished the New York bar exam. But due to funding delays from the US Department of State for the specific justice project that I would be working on the ground, we weren't able to start until January 2020. Then in January, the relationship between the US and Iran deteriorated, and the prospect of tension was exacerbated, especially in Iraq, where both nations were engaging in a proxy war. So while I was in transit to Iraq at the airport in Bali, I was in transit there, I received an email from my supervisor informing me that the project would be delayed and due to the security risks, and basically recommended that I should reschedule my flight as the rest of my team would not be flying until the next month. But of course, for me, it was too late because I was already on my way to the Kurdish region. When I arrived, people were really anxious and feared the possibility of war breaking out. During the first few nights, there were numerous attacks by, I guess, what were attributed to Iran through proxies on US army bases in Erbil, as well as other locations in Iraq. Many feared that the situation would escalate further and lead to more serious attacks. Many organizations were planning immediate evacuation of their foreign workers. But I, because of having, strong network and family there, decided that I would just see what would happen. And of course, for that region, due to all the, the reasons that I've explained, my family had been well accustomed to risks such as this and was not necessarily panicking straight away. So fortunately, the attacks decreased and I remained in Erbil. So while my fellowship was delayed, it ended up actually being a blessing in disguise because I was able to use the time to see my family more and connect more with my language and culture. Then eventually I made my way over to Duhok in the Kurdish region of Iraq to meet the rest of my team and begin our work. Our team faced numerous logistical challenges from the start, such as issues with accommodation, our office not being available. But for someone like me, I was largely unfazed by having to work from a couch in the apartment and quickly became accustomed to the power cuts, water shortages, and internet disconnections. I had prepared myself for much worse, so I easily learned to adapt to situations like this. And my life experiences of growing up in a refugee camp also helped me be quite resilient to whatever was thrown my way while there. So naturally, this placed me in a more supportive role. So while my teammates who'd come from the West and not experienced anything like this really struggled, I was able to be a supportive and reassuring figure for them at this time. Eventually, we began the work and we engaged in very comprehensive training because of the sensitive nature of the work that we'd be engaged in, using specifically what is called a peace model for interviewing adult survivors. This was really critical because after the ISIS attacks, there was just an overwhelming number of journalists, researchers, lawyers, all sorts of different kinds of professions coming in, mostly with good intentions, wanting to document, interview, and capture the atrocities that had occurred, but actually ended up doing a lot of damage because they weren't trained adequately to do these kind of interviews with survivors who just experienced a lot of trauma. And so this model and the training that we were engaging in was so critical that we had to spend a lot of time ensuring that we wouldn't do more damage than then necessary in essence to do the work that we intended to do. So this peace model, planning and preparation, engaging and explaining, accounting, clarification, the closure, evaluation, was a framework that supported, well, it is because we continue to use it to this day, but basically it's a framework that supports the conducting of effective, ethical and survivor-centered interviews. The core principles for this model are: one, to do no harm. Secondly, informed consent, confidentiality, security, and care. So the aim of all of our documentation was to minimize as far as possible harm to the individuals. If we felt in a situation that by interviewing or documenting the evidence, it would do more harm to that individual, we would decide not to go ahead with it, because obviously the health and well-being of the individual outweighs any need for documentation or evidence gathering. An equally important objective was to ensure that those doing the documentation felt empowered to decide not to proceed in an instance where the likelihood of causing harm could not be sufficiently reduced. In terms of informed consent, the key was to respect the autonomy of participants. Anyone providing information about sexual violence must give informed consent before participating in the data gathering activity, and the confidentiality of all individuals who provided information about sexual violence must be protected at all times. And these were just non-negotiable. And also, in addition to that, the safety and security of those involved in giving information was of paramount concern. And in emergency settings in particular, these had to be monitored, because obviously the risk of further harm, a lot of the members of ISIS had not necessarily been arrested. There were still family members of those involved. And so there were multiple risks in that regard that had to be considered as well. So after this comprehensive training, about a week into doing interviews was when the government announced a lockdown in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, at that point not yet labeled a pandemic, but basically the closure of airports. And so within a week of all of this hitting the news headlines and fast decisions being made, my entire team evacuated back to their respective countries. And this was the point where I was, faced with this ultimate decision: do I return back to New Zealand or do I stay? And I made the decision to stay and continue to do this work, because I felt that I had a strong support network. I had family there, and I also wanted to get the experience. And at the time, no one knew how long the lockdowns would be in place and what was going to happen. And so I took that risk. Unfortunately, very shortly afterwards, the government restricted movement entirely, meaning that I couldn't even go into the camps anymore to interview survivors. And so at this stage, we had to reevaluate our work entirely. The core of our work was evidence gathering, and without physically interviewing survivors and witnesses, our objectives were impacted significantly. And we considered alternatives. We considered conducting interviews online, but due to the extremely sensitive nature of the interviews, we decided that online interviews were not feasible. And so instead we focused our attention to gathering information and preparing for interviews that may occur in the future using open source investigation techniques. Fast forward a little bit, once the lockdown measures eventually eased, I returned to work and started interviewing, but without the rest of my team. So there I was on my own, interviewing without the other 4 lawyers that were supposed to be doing this work there too. Before I got into this work, I spoke to a lot of people that had done interviewing and documentation of mass atrocities, and they say you always remember your first interview. And I will absolutely always remember my first interview. I will never forget that interview. My first interview was somewhat of a public figure, as she'd written a book on her experiences and had become a very prominent activist within Iraq. This meant that she was comfortable and confident speaking about her experiences under ISIS captivity. But for me, given that it was my first interview, I was not so comfortable. Initially, I found it extremely difficult to ask questions about rape and sexual violence. Firstly, because it is, of course, traumatic, but secondly, because the entire topic of sex is considered taboo in the culture that I've been raised in, and I was now asking someone in the same language about these topics that had been considered taboo my entire upbringing. I remember prior to that particular interview, I did a lot of work. I was very prepared for the interview. I had done plenty of research. I'd read the interviews all about her background, which is not usually information that is available. But in this case, she had a book that I had read, and I had prepared all my questions beforehand. I literally could not be more prepared. But once I started the interview, I realized the minute that I started that interviewing victims of mass atrocity required very different skills to the skills we're taught as these conscientious, studious law students. So while preparation is extremely important, these were skills that you just could not learn from reading. And the only way to learn it was by just simply doing it. Interviewing survivors, I think, requires you to be somewhat superhuman. On the one hand, to ask questions and pull out as much information as you can, but at the same time being empathetic and respectful of boundaries. On the one hand, to ask difficult questions, yet be supportive. It requires the ability to be confident in asking questions, but then soften that approach, to frame questions eloquently, yet not be too robotic or mechanical, to be methodological and mentally ticking off the checklist of all, the elements of the crime and the evidence that you need of each, and ask the right questions, yet at the same time, while you're asking them, be really natural and flexible, to be professional, yet build a connection, and get someone to trust you with some of the most personal and traumatic experiences of their life. And so I thought, wow, this is so difficult. And throughout the interview, you need to think about what a judge in court will learn from the evidence, what gaps the cross-examination will identify, and how a jury will react. And this is all while continuously gauging your interviewee, whether they need a break, assessing the mental health of the interview. I mean, as much as you can from your subjective layman perspective, to ensure that they're not in a position where they're too traumatized to continue. So all of these things are just going through my mind, and it was overwhelming, incredibly difficult. Ironically, I found great comfort in my first interviewee, while it should have probably been the other way around. But it was comforting to have someone like her as my first interview, as she eased me into this interview and broke down all this awkwardness associated to speaking about what ordinarily was really considered taboo in our culture. So I'll never, ever forget that interview and everything that I learned in that interview. And so building from there, since then, it's been 2 years, and I have done many interviews with many survivors who had all been held captive by ISIS at one point, ranging from 2 years to 6 years. What these women had endured and the traumatic experiences that they have faced is incomprehensible. It's beyond words. As lawyers, we're trained to separate emotion from work, but at the end of the day, we're still human. When I was sitting in front of a survivor, listening to their stories, I couldn't help but feel immense anger and sadness that they had to go through this. And I felt, just tremendous anger that there are people so inhumane that they could inflict this kind of pain on another human being. Before I went into this particular field of law, I had worked as a corporate litigator. The hours were long, the work was stressful, but in this field, it was stressful in a different way. Speaking regularly with victims of such vile crimes, the secondary trauma is a very common effect amongst lawyers working in this field. And I'd worked on many legal issues before doing this work as well. I'd worked, as I mentioned, and corporate litigation, so at a very large commercial firm in New Zealand, and then at the New Zealand Human Rights Commission. And I'd worked in lots of different positions around the globe, in Kenya for the UN, and Colombia and Ecuador on cases of people who had fled the Colombian Civil War. And so I'd worked on lots of different cases with people who'd experienced what they deemed to be an atrocity in their life, meaning that I had built some skills to be able to deal with major issues like this. But in this context, the stresses were different. We were dealing with genocide, sexual slavery, the killings of the Yazidi population. It was very different to the cases that I'd worked on before. I'd never done anything at that level where it was a group level mass atrocity and war crimes committed against a group of people simply for their identity. And of course, I'm still very junior when it comes to this kind of work. It was my first real experience in this particular area dealing with genocide. And so I didn't know what to expect or how to deal with the work related stress in the beginning. And I don't think I was quite prepared for what was to come. But luckily I had great mentors, and my supervisor was incredibly supportive when it came to looking after our mental health, and we had many services available to us. At the end of the day, we're all human, we're not robots. And as much as they tell you to separate your work from your life, sometimes just sitting there listening to the stories of the various victims that we were working with, I just wanted to break down the need to constantly remind myself to practice self-care in this regard. And still, while the experiences were hard for me to hear, I could only imagine how difficult it must have been for the person recounting their own horrors to me. And what I really gathered at the end of this kind of work, and upon reflecting, was that what's really important is just knowing when you've had a very difficult interview. And so instead of pushing myself to do another one straight after, sometimes I had to just recognize that it was important to take time off so that I could be more effective in my work. And when I first started, I didn't realize many things were related. For example, insomnia and difficulty sleeping and changes in mood. I didn't realize that these were just side effects of some of the work that I was doing, and what they call secondary trauma. At the time, I ignored it and didn't think much of it. But when I discussed some of these factors with my supervisor, she explained that this was quite common within this kind of work, and that there were very high cases of secondary trauma, so that each of us had to really look after ourselves. So, I mean, while I've been in the Kurdistan region for now 2 years, I still think that it's quite early in my career to understand exactly what will work for me in this regard in the future. And so I'm just learning the skills and figuring out what would work best for me in this context. And this work has been incredibly, incredibly important to me. And I know that through our justice efforts, we will never be able to give back what these victims lost, but those who are responsible need to be held accountable in one way or another, and justice must be served. And to me, a prosecution in a court of law, recognizing the harm that they've committed against these victims is a form of strong accountability and justice that I'm very much committed to working on long term. So this has been a bit, I guess, about the more formal legal work that I've been doing. And of course, I wouldn't be a true Fulbrighter without making use of my spare time while working here. And so during the times that I wasn't interviewing survivors and working on legal cases, I was working on various projects to support refugees in the region. In particular, some directly related to the pandemic. Of course, we're facing unprecedented challenges all around the globe due to the pandemic. But as the pandemic accelerated, those at greatest risk were in the beginning and remains now at greatest risk have been refugees living in camps in developing countries. in refugee camps, the cramped living conditions, the lack of sanitation, the limited access to food, the limited clean water, lack of soap, and extremely limited health facilities has put millions of refugees and displaced communities at a severe risk of contracting the virus and spreading it faster, and having very limited access even now to vaccines around the globe. So this only frustrates global efforts to slow the spread and contain the virus. The only response in Kurdistan, where I was based, was a complete shutdown of the camps to try protect the contraction and spread of the virus. But what that meant was that refugees in need of services became even more vulnerable because NGOs couldn't work to their full extent in delivering services. So with the communities that I was working with, we led a fundraising campaign to distribute food and supplies to refugee families through the lockdown. We did the fundraising through my New Zealand registered charity Empower, and we were able to raise enough funds through our networks in Aotearoa to distribute to 300 refugee families in camps. And so that was something that we could achieve with the help of Kiwis contributing directly to our charity. While in Kurdistan, I've also been working on an area that I'm extremely passionate about, and that's access to education for refugees. We've organized and provided workshops to youth across 7 refugee camps in the Kurdistan region. And just to tell you a little bit about what the stats are in regard to access to education and why it's so important. Globally, only 50% of refugee children have access to primary education, only 25% have access to secondary education, and only 3% make it to higher education. And so children are disproportionately impacted by forced displacement. No child should pay the cost of conflict by missing out on schooling, yet we see generations of refugee children unable to access education. And education is crucial because children can be protected from human trafficking, illegal adoption, child marriage, sexual exploitation, and forced labor simply by being in a classroom environment. In conflict and other crises, higher education serves as a powerful driver for change. It can shelter and protect a critical group of young people by maintaining their hopes for the future. It can help foster inclusion and non-discrimination and acts as a strong catalyst for the recovery and rebuilding of post-conflict countries. Education is pivotal to changing the future for refugees, and there's no future for countries affected by conflict or other crises unless the young children learn and receive an education that provides them the tools and the skills to then be empowered to make positive change in their communities. For me, I may be a Harvard-educated lawyer now, but at one point I was just a refugee with dreams. And it is due to education that I am where I am today. And so our goal is to access opportunities for education for all refugees and enhance access to quality education and ensure that refugee youth have access to higher education so they too can dream bigger and achieve their goals. Education allows them to contribute not only to their own lives, but to their families, their communities, and ultimately their nations. And so we've continuously been providing workshops and helping to bridge the gap between schooling and also access to higher education in the global context. But while I've been in Kurdistan, that's been particularly on my agenda through Empower. We have an event coming up in March as well called the 3C Forum, focusing specifically on solutions to higher education in the region. And so I'm very excited to be able to bring all stakeholders together, governments, UNHCR, refugee communities, NGOs, and education institutions to try to come up with better solutions that are sustainable and more innovative in accessing education. And during this time, I've also partnered on a project with the president of the American University in Kurdistan. We've organized outings and events for Yazidi orphans whose parents have been taken or killed by ISIS. We've taken these children to many places for the first time in their lives, such as really simple places like cinemas, bowling, restaurants, and museums, because at the end of the day, these are children and they just want to have fun too. It's not just all about attending mental health and workshops and educational opportunities. Sometimes they just want to not stress about anything beyond their age and what they've had to go through, and just enjoy going to the cinema with their friends. And so this has been a really, really rewarding opportunity for me, just spending some time with some of these young children and just being witness to the joy that some of these simple things in life they've been denied as young children. Also during this time, my co-founders and I have launched the Centre for the Asia Pacific Refugee Studies based at the University of Auckland to respond to the issues of forced displacement. So we're now about 1.5 years old. So we literally launched during the pandemic. The centre is responding in particular to forced displacement in the Asia Pacific region. In the Asia Pacific region alone, there are over 7.7 million forcibly displaced people. An average of 26 million people are displaced by natural disasters annually. So that means 1 person per second. And climate change will disproportionately impact the Asia Pacific region, displacing tens of millions of people by the year 2050, it's estimated, or simply by natural disasters and climate change. And so despite the obvious need in light of these pressing issues, there were no centres, academic centres, focusing specifically on the Asia Pacific region. And so this is why we decided to launch the Centre for Asia Pacific Refugee Studies at the University of Auckland to respond to these challenges in context with a commitment to positive change, inclusion, and social cohesion in New Zealand and the Asia Pacific through evidence-based scholarship with a focus on high-impact research. The Centre's principal goal is to develop positive solutions for people forcibly displaced by conflict and climate-induced disasters. From the outset, the Centre has been driven by a transformative agenda that places social justice and human rights as core aspects of its work. The Centre has a strong orientation towards capacity building and co-designing to ensure that all projects provide a platform from scholars across the globe, both Global South and Global North. And where particular projects are based, the Centre's work has sought to establish and honour local and Indigenous voices to understand the historical, social, cultural, and political context in which displacement occurs. Whilst recognising the importance of vulnerability and how structural forces have rendered certain groups vulnerable, the Centre also maintains a strength-based focus to ensure that refugees and other displaced people are not understood and marginalised through a deficit-focused lens. A key focus of the Centre's scholarship seeks to empower people's voices and agency alongside maintaining a critical understanding of how people, power, history, and context shape such opportunities. And so at the heart of all the work that I've been doing since I've had the great opportunity and privilege of being awarded a Fulbright has been focusing on issues that really impact people and their lives. And so it feels fitting to end on this Māori proverb, he aha te mea nui o te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is the most important thing in the world? It is the people, it is the people, it is the people. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you so much, Rez. That was fascinating, and I'm just absolutely astounded at not only the emotional intensity of the work that you're doing, but also how incredibly important it is. You know, it's I can't even begin to fathom how extraordinary the scope of what you're doing is. You know, one of the questions that I wanted to ask is, when you're faced with something so big, when you're talking about genocide, when you're talking about ISIS, when you're talking about these incredibly enormous issues, how do you, as a lawyer and as a person, as a human, how do you not feel overwhelmed?
I'm not going to pretend that I figured that all out, because all the different issues that I feel very strongly about, all the different injustices around the world that are happening as we speak, sometimes just really overwhelm me. You know, when you're really passionate about these issues, it's natural to want to contribute to more than just one thing, but then recognizing that actually there's only so much you can do alone as well. And so for me, I think what I've really tried to focus on is, and often I do get overwhelmed, but to bring myself back to the cause that I'm focusing on, and realizing that there are so many different causes and important work that needs to be done, but using my strengths in a particular you know, setting that I feel that I can have the most impact, and then bringing it down to that particular task. So there's a lot of injustice around the world, even if we're just talking about mass atrocity, human rights abuses, war crimes, terrorism. Even in that one field, you know, not even talking about all the different areas, even in that one field, there are so many different situations in the world that I would think about and say, well, I want to focus on that. I want to do that too. I want to contribute in one way, but it's bringing it back down to that one task. And I think for me right now, that cause is, you know, gathering evidence and then documenting it as well as I can, and then handing it over to the prosecutor's office to then do their job. And if that evidence is gathered in a good way, if we provide strong dossiers of evidence, then, you know, you've done your small bit, and then you hand it over to the next person who needs to do their bit. And then so it requires a whole number of people doing different parts of the process to achieve that end goal. And so then if they can then build a strong case in court, and then a judge finds a verdict of guilty for that particular ISIS member, then, you know, we've all contributed to something. It may, you know, the roles are different, but that's how I like to view it, as, you know, what's my small bit in this bigger picture? I can't do it all.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I agree that is, I can only imagine that would be the only approach that you could take, because in the face of this and these enormous problems, you know, as you've already discovered, you know, when you set up Empower and when you've done the work with the, you know, University of Auckland and so on, you've kind of been able to gather people together and to do this work in teams, which surely sort of is about the only thing you can do. We've got a question in the chat box here, which I'm wondering, it's not really your area, and I think it's potentially opening up a can of worms, so we might not be able to get into it too much. But Panthea has asked what your view is on the traffic light system, which we're using in New Zealand, and on mandating vaccinations, and if you've got any idea about what the role of human rights is in that. So you feel free to answer that if you like. It's also, you know, it's a question, a big question. I'm aware that you're not actually based in New Zealand currently, so yeah.
Actually, yeah, I don't think I'm in a good position to answer that, because I have not been in New Zealand for the last 2 years throughout the entire pandemic. And so my view of what's been happening is formed by being in the global south, if you want to call it, in the Kurdish region of Iraq, where the situation is very different. And my situation has been very different to my family's in New Zealand. What I can say from my experience is that a lot of people have not been vaccinated where I am. The number of deaths is extremely high. There are no lockdown measures in place. And so on the one hand, I can see directly the impact of those things combined, not having any measures implemented by the government, not having really any restrictions in place, people not being vaccinated and not having a good healthcare system has resulted in a huge number of deaths personally in my family as well. And so for the situation that I'm in, I think that if we had better things in place, better restrictions on behalf of the government here, then perhaps we wouldn't have had so many deaths.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a question that I wanted to ask about. You referred to the I think it was, you said the peace model for dealing and interviewing adult survivors. And I'm really interested in what that entails. Is that something, it's certainly not a term or a kind of idea that I've heard of before. So I wondered if you could just give us a little bit more information about what the peace model is.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, after the fall of ISIS, there was an overwhelming number of people that came and really flooded the region to write books, to write news stories, to film documentaries, and a lot of these were done without much regard, whether intentionally or unintentionally is a different story, but without enough regard for the trauma that then inflicts on people who've already suffered a lot of trauma, and to do them in an ethical way. So the peace model, and I'll explain what each stands for. So the P is planning and preparation. The E is engaging and explaining. And the C is the account. The A is the account. The C is the clarification, and closure, and then the E is the evaluation. And so it supports this conducting of effective, ethical, and survivor-centered interviews, taking the view that if you've planned and prepped, done all the background, prepared your questions and what you want out of the interview, and then you've gone into that interview, obviously, with a clear vision of what you're hoping to achieve from it, there's then again less likelihood that you will get engaged in questions that you haven't given much thought or could be triggering. I mean, of course, subject to the fact that, whenever you enter a situation like interviewing, questions may come up that you hadn't planned, but at least it's given you a frame of mind to think about exactly where you're going with each kind of question, and you're asking questions for a reason, not just for the sake of it. And then engaging and explaining. So really ensuring that the survivor knows what the outcome of this interview will be. You cannot make any promises about, seek justice, or even that their case will lead to any result at all. Obviously, the legal system is unpredictable. Sometimes prosecutions take years. Sometimes there won't even be enough evidence, so the case is thrown out. And even where a case does go through, it may not result in the outcome that was hoped for. And so really ensuring that the survivor is not set up for any expectations that you simply just cannot promise. And also their confidentiality. So you will not divulge any of that information without their consent, that they understand specifically what it's for. And so really that's the ethical aspect of it. And they know exactly where the information is going to go, and if they agree or don't agree to that. So each of these steps is obviously framed around trying to do as the interview in the most ethical and effective way possible, guided by these underlying principles of doing no harm, informed consent, confidentiality, security, and care. So the main objective of all documentation in any interview is to minimize as far as possible harm to that individual. So by going in and seeking information, we should not be putting the individual at the risk of more harm by just as a result of this interview. So yeah, it's a very specific training that we've done to be able to do these interviews, and this is just for adult survivors. And so when you're talking about interviewing children, there's just a whole nother set of trainings and guidelines that need to be taken into account. Unfortunately, there are still many places around the world and many contexts where people do not abide by such guidelines, and it can result in very, very traumatic experiences for the survivors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that really struck me while you were sharing about that was just the incredible bravery. You touched upon that as well, but not just the strength and the courage that it takes you as a lawyer coming in to interview and to ask these incredibly difficult questions, but also the bravery for the survivors who are then recounting these stories for hopefully the greater good. The idea that there hopefully will be some justice somewhere along the line, and that's just it's something I find it hard to actually get my head around, is that level of bravery. And I can fully understand as well when you talked about the secondary trauma, and not to dwell on all of this, of course, but I can really understand how that would be such an unbelievably taxing thing. And it doesn't surprise me when you talked about having insomnia and the various other things that can kind of go along with that. And I'm sure that hearing a lot of those really, really difficult conversations must take its toll. One further question I had, and obviously if anyone else has a question, feel free to just either type it in the chat or just pipe up. But one other question I had is, you've done a lot in your short years. You've packed in a lot, and you've been to a lot of places, and you've experienced a lot of things. And I wondered what is next for you, if you've got any plans for the coming future. Obviously, COVID does sort of throw a spanner in the works for everyone to some degree, but I'm just wondering what's next.
Yeah, this is the golden question, isn't it? It's very unpredictable. When I first was in law school, and in the first couple of years of my career, I planned everything to how long I would work somewhere and what would happen next and where I would go next. But with this nature of the work that I've been doing, all the unpredictability and plans not going ahead as we thought, in August 2019, I thought I was going to work in DC, and then all of a sudden they're like, actually, you have to go straight to the field, and then ended up starting that job in February, unplanned completely, and everything was thrown completely beyond my imagination for what could possibly go wrong. Things just kept coming up, and so I learned that in this field of work you can't really plan ahead. It's just kind of scary, because I think as humans, perhaps we crave having some sort of certainty in our lives, and at least knowing where we're going to set up base and live and what that would look like. So that it's a bit scary to think I don't know where I'm going to be next, or even which part of the world. But I feel that the kind of person that I am is that I want to be involved in something action oriented. So I naturally don't gravitate towards jobs sitting in a big fancy office, say in parts of the world where I would be working on maybe similar issues, but a couple degrees separated. I think I need to be on the ground, on my feet. And so it doesn't necessarily mean I'd have to be in the region that I'm in. There are opportunities obviously in New Zealand and in other parts of the world where I could be part of the action and on my feet. But all I know is that it can't be just sitting at a desk somewhere. I have to get involved in work that just gets, gets me thinking, you know, this is why I wake up each day in the morning. I'm contributing to something that is much bigger than me.
Yes, you don't strike me as someone who is going to be a pencil pusher. So it makes total sense to me that you will be out doing something in the field, so to speak. I'm also very conscious of the time, and I'm wondering if there are any other questions. It doesn't look like there are. Nothing's been written in the chat box. So I think we're pretty, yeah, it looks like we're pretty much safe to say that we can, someone said thank you. Panthea said thanks. Yes, I agree. It has been a pleasure having you here and hearing you talk. And I guess just before we go, I wanted to just reiterate again from us that, you know, for Fulbright New Zealand, it's just wonderful to know that you are out there doing this unbelievably important work, and also that Fulbright New Zealand has been able to contribute to that in some small way. You know, it really is quite, it's quite an incredible achievement, and the things that you're doing are so important. So yeah, everyone's saying thank you so much. It's incredible, your work. And yeah, I wanted to say thanks from all of us here at Fulbright for your talk, and best of luck with everything. I know it's tricky for you at the moment, especially with COVID carry on, but you are doing an amazing job. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for your kind comments. It's been a pleasure sharing a little bit about my work. And yeah, I know it's midday in New Zealand now. We're just hitting 1 a.m. in Geneva. So I'm a night owl though, so that's fine. But yeah, no, it's been really nice. And thanks for hosting this. Thanks to my Fulbright whānau. You've really opened up a lot of opportunities for me, and I'm very proud to be part of this community. Tēnā koutou.